What is up guys, it's Aaron from Rudy Visuals, and in today's video we're going to go over some basic photography terms that every beginner should know. So I guess I'll see you after that intro. So this video is going to be aimed at you guys who are just starting out at photography, or maybe you just got your first ever camera or DSLR. Now, we know from personal experience that being a beginner in this field can be really intimidating, particularly when it comes to terminology. There's a lot of terms out there that can be pretty confusing for a newcomer, but it is quite important that you have a basic understanding of some of the more common terms. So we're going to go over some of those today and hopefully try to explain them in a very simple way. Okay, so we're going to kick things off with the word aperture. So aperture is basically the amount of light that you let into your lens. So you can choose to actually open up your lens physically, which basically opens up the aperture, which lets in more light into your camera, or you can close it to let in less light. Now, aperture is measured in f-stop. So if you're watching things like lens reviews, you might hear things like this lens has a maximum aperture of f2.8 or f4. That's basically the widest that lens can go. Adjusting the aperture allows you to correctly expose your photo, as well as control the depth of field. More on this later. Next up, we have ISO. So in the most basic terms, ISO is a setting on your camera that lets you brighten or darken your photo. But unlike aperture, nothing is actually physically changing in your lens or your camera. Instead, what you're doing is adjusting the sensitivity of your camera sensor to light. The higher the ISO, the brighter your image will get, but at the expense of noise and details. Basically, you'll get a lower quality image. You might notice when you shoot or film in the dark, the images don't look as nice during the day when you can leave your ISO nice and low. Typically, photographers will bump up their ISO if they're in a dark environment or when the lighting isn't as nice. Next up, we have shutter speed. So every time you take a photo, the shutter in your camera actually opens and closes. Shutter speed simply refers to how long that shutter stays open for. Shutter speeds typically range from like 30 seconds to 1/4000th of a second. At 30 seconds, the shutter obviously stays open for a very long time, which allows time for light to go into your sensor, and it also blurs motion as well. This is particularly useful in dark environments for nighttime photography, and that blurred motion creates a very nice artistic style, which is commonly seen in things like long exposure photography. On the flip side, a faster shutter speed requires a lot of light because that shutter is only open for a very, very short time. But this is generally more desirable if you want to get a nice sharp image. Typically, sports photographers and wildlife photographers would shoot at a higher shutter speed. If you imagine fast moving athletes or like a really fast animal, they want to capture that motion and really freeze it, get it nice and sharp. Whereas if they shot at a lower shutter speed, you might get some blurred motion. This can be cool for an artistic effect, but generally speaking, a higher shutter speed means a sharper image. So next up, we have focal length. This is the distance between the lens and the actual sensor, and basically controls the field of view that you see. So you might hear this lens has a 24mm focal length, or a 50 or 150 millimeters. When you have a shorter lens, for example, a 18mm, you see a wider view. A longer focal length, such as 85mm, typically tends to be better for portraits because you have more compression. It's a lot more flattering on people, there's less distortion. Whereas a wider focal length, for example, 24 or 18mm, typically has more distortion, so it's not as good for portraits, but it's much better for example, landscapes or architecture, when you can get so much more in the actual field of view. All right, so here's another very common term, bokeh. Simply put, bokeh refers to the out of focus elements in the picture, which are produced and rendered by the lens that you're using on your camera. This is kind of a popular and kind of desirable quality in modern photography, particularly when you want a subject to stand out from the background, for example, in portraits or wildlife. Bokeh can be achieved by using a lens with a very wide aperture, usually around f2.8 or higher gets you very nice looking bokeh. However, you can still create this effect without a fast lens, just by moving the camera closer to your subject and your subject further away from the background. So closely related to bokeh is depth of field. So depth of field is basically how much of your image is in focus. You can have a very shallow depth of field, so only a very small part of your image is in focus. Again, commonly seen in portraits. Or a deeper depth of field. This is when more of your image is in focus, right through through from your foreground to your background. Remember we talked about aperture before? Well, adjusting that allows you to choose what kind of depth of field you get in your image. You might choose to have a deeper depth of field if you want the things in your background to be in focus, or you might choose a shallower depth of field if you want that subject to be the focus. Okay, so next up we have the word exposure. So exposure is basically the amount of light that actually reaches your camera's sensor. Exposure is affected by those things we mentioned before, such as aperture, ISO, shutter speed. All of those come together to give you your final exposure. For example, the term underexposed means a picture that's too dark, whereas overexposed is a picture that's too bright. So the camera operator typically adjusts the aperture, ISO and shutter speed, so you have a good balance between those bright areas and those dark areas to get you a nicely exposed image. Okay, next up we have the term RAW. This is an uncompressed file format that most modern cameras save their image as. A RAW file retains the maximum amount of information in the file, which then allows more room for you to manipulate your file in post and editing afterwards. This means, for example, an image that was shot that's too dark can actually be salvaged in post because that image has retained that data within the actual file. Compared to JPEG, which is another common file format, which is designed to actually save space, so it doesn't retain as much detail and you lose that ability to manipulate things afterwards in post. Typically, most photographers will shoot in RAW because they have that ability to manipulate and stylize their photos with more freedom in post. Okay, so next up we have white balance. Simply put, white balance is the way the camera adjusts the colors to make them appear natural. So the camera will actually adjust the color temperature of your image so that the whites appear pure white, without any color hues that you would get from having different light sources. So for example, if you took a white piece of paper and you took it outside and indoors and took a photo of it, you might notice that that white is actually a different color in both those images. Adjusting the white balance ensures that that white is actually pure white, no matter what kind of environment you're in. Okay, so finally we have noise. So this can be kind of a confusing topic, but basically in photography, noise is a grain-like texture in the image that can't actually be avoided, it can only be minimized. So if a photo is very noisy, you might also start noticing discoloration, and this can potentially ruin your photos. Noise tends to happen when you shoot at higher ISO numbers or in very, very low light. It can be very noticeable if you're using a bad camera, like typically on your phone. Phones don't really have very good noise performance. You'll especially notice it in videos because the noise tends to jump around. Now, DSLR cameras and mirrorless cameras tend to have much better noise performance than smartphones, for example. So ISO 1600, for example, on a camera might look pretty clean, not too noisy compared to the same ISO on a phone, and you'll probably notice that it's very, very noisy and not as good looking as on the camera. General rule of speaking, you want to have as little noise as possible in your images. Okay, so that's the end of my list. Hopefully you found that helpful. There are obviously a lot more terms out there, but this video could go on for like 3 or 4 hours if we covered every single word. It's not vital that you know every single word out there. You don't have to be a walking dictionary. However, understanding the basics, understanding them does make you a smarter shooter and will make you more efficient with your camera. So it's definitely worth revising and getting to know how these things actually affect the final photo that you're getting from your camera. So it will definitely help you in terms of the process of taking photos and just having that deeper knowledge of how your camera works. Anyway guys, if you have any further questions, do feel free to leave them in the comment section below and we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. If you like this video, do give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button and the bell if you want to see more of our videos. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook as well. We always love to hear from you guys on there. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I guess I'll see you on the next video. All right.